Hello. Welcome. Hi. How you all doing? Lovely to see you here. Sorry for the very slightly late start there. I'm a minute late. I'm appalled. I apologize. Welcome to the Great American Taste Test live with all of you and me. There's a few of us here now. There's about 3,500 of us here, which is already a number I can't comprehend, but that's very exciting. What we're going to do today is I'll run you through a few bits and pieces before we do the tasting. First things first, if you don't have your pods, go and get them out of the freezer. It's okay if they're still frozen. We've got a little time. There's some stuff to talk about, but you need pods. So go grab them if you have not got them yet. If they've been out for a while, that's totally fine. Don't stress about it, but get those pods. Now, go. I'll be honest with you today. I do not stand a chance of keeping up with the live chat. And so there are some people monitoring the live chat. They're going to grab questions that when there's a kind of Q&A section or there's a moment or a pause, they're going to feed me some questions that I can answer. But hello to all of you. I wish I could respond to everyone, but I can't. So let me run you quickly through kind of how today is going to go. A little bit of housekeeping at the start. Make sure you've got everything that you need. And then we can get on and do some tasting. So yeah, I'll talk about this for a little bit. I would say maybe 10 minutes before we start to boil a kettle. Probably not even that, actually. Then we'll do a tasting, and that'll last a little while. And then after that, there'll be some time for some Q&A, and we'll wrap things up. So I would say we'll be done in not more than an hour. Depends how long Q&A goes on for. Depends how much energy I have for lots and lots of questions. So important stuff for today. The primary goal for today is for us all to have some fun. That's the #1 goal. So this should be not too serious, but at the same time, the second goal is to do some citizen science and to do a taste test that we hope will yield some really interesting results. And I'm kind of excited about that. So that's definitely a key part of it. And then, of course, I hope it's a learning experience. Anytime you do a comparative tasting, I think it's a great chance to learn. And I hope you'll have fun doing a comparative tasting here with me. So, like I said, let's just run through the things you're going to need for today. Things nice and simple. Box of pods, at least one of each. If you're sharing your tasting, you're a very good person, and you might use both of them. You're going to need some water. Now, quick note on water. I'm using pretty much distilled water. If you're using distilled water too, that's amazing, because then we can have a pretty much identical experience, and that's very exciting. Soft filtered water is okay. If you only have really hard water or water that has quite a lot of bicarbonates in it, that will change the way the coffee tastes. And so it's up to you. You can always watch this later and grab some distilled and kind of watch this again tomorrow or another time if you really want the sort of most accurate experience. But soft water, low in bicarbonates, distilled is fine. I wouldn't regularly recommend using distilled water in a kettle, but in this one instance, I think it's okay, kind of useful. We're going to need something to melt into. Now, I'm going to use carafes today, mostly because I'm sharing my tasting too. So I'm going to melt into each of these carafes. I'm going to pour then into a cup for me. You could obviously just pour into an 8-ounce sort of sized mug or melt into there and taste from there too. That's totally okay. I would say you're going to need, ideally, some sort of spoon. It doesn't have to be fancy and purple. Mine are fancy and purple because I'm a fancy man. And I like a fancy purple spoon. But you don't need it can be a soup spoon, dessert spoon, it could be a coffee cupping spoon. If you have one, that would be great. In some situations, you might want 2 per person. We'll cover those, don't worry. Or you might want just like a little tasting cup. Again, if it's you're sharing a kind of tasting and you want to make it as sanitary as possible. I'll also be using a set of scales today. I am going to do my best to talk in both American and metric. So we're going to be working with sort of 8 ounces of water when we melt, or about 230 grams. But you could use a measuring cup in theory if you really needed to. But scales are good for not making mistakes. That's why I like them in the morning before I've had coffee. It helps you not make mistakes when I make coffee. And then lastly, you should have, if you got the kit, your little tasting card that I will also walk you through. That'll be nice. If you don't have this, there is a link in the description box that will take you to the website where you can download a PDF. There should still be time to print 1 or 2 extra if you want. You might want to take notes on one, or if you mess it up and you want to do it again. So these, useful. You will need one of these for later. And that, I think, covers the things you're going to need for today, pretty much. Let me double check I've got everything I need here. Now, just check. Yeah, I see comments on the metric thing. I'll do both. I'll try and do both. I promise. I'll do temperatures. There's only one temperature. We're going to boil the water to 100 degrees Celsius or 212 Fahrenheit in a little bit. But there's just more stuff to talk about first. Where am I? Right. So we'll kind of cover sharing a tasting once we get to the sort of hot liquids bit, and it'll make a bit more sense. The one other thing that I really did want to talk about now is about the information that you'll submit. So once you fill this in, we'd like you to submit it through a link in the website that is, again, linked in the description. Now, we're not trying to collect proprietary information here. What we do want to do is share the information that we collect. So just know that your information will be anonymized. There'll be no personally identifying information attached to your data. And then there's extra questions that would make this so much more interesting if we could get the honest answers to them as well. Not everything's mandatory. You don't have to fill in that extra data, but it would be so interesting if you're willing to share it to improve the quality of research and just to understand what people like better, where people are in their coffee journey, what they're into, what they're not into as well. Seems fair? I hope so. So I hope you'll take the time to submit for each person that took part. It would be so cool. And we will, as I said, anonymize and then open source the data at the end of it and share the interesting things that we learned. One last thing before we get to melting. If your pods are not yet sort of defrosted, you can sort of tell if a pod's ready when you shake it. And if it's still stuck to the inside, then what you can do, just run it very quickly under a tap and it will just loosen off. And if you shake it and you can hear the sort of puck rattling around in there, then I think you're pretty much good to go. So at this point, yeah, I think at this point, I'm going to start my kettle going. I'm going to start heating up some water. I'm going to decant one of each of these into each of my carafes. Now, if you're familiar with some of these roasters, don't let any preconceptions sneak in. Do you know what I mean? Like, you might have had coffee from these roasters, you might have had capsules from these roasters before, and you might have an expectation of how they're going to taste. I would say let go of those expectations. It'll catch you out if you carry them. So just go into this open-minded. I will remind you of the order as we go. They are sort of everywhere, so I don't think it'd be too tricky. They're on the scoring thing here. They're going to be in the kind of order here. I'll line them up and show you a top down when I'm done. That'll also be in the order. Be nice and be organized. Right. I feel like it's weird being in a room on my own, talking to all of you. I keep waiting for someone to be like, okay, let's go. So I'm going to boil the kettle. Off you go. And quickly run mine under a tap, just so that they're nice and loose. I'll show you what it sounds like when they are. That is the sound of a loose puck. So let me just do these quickly. Right. Hopefully, if there's some sound issues, they've gone away now. Apologies for those. You are going to listen to a kettle boil, though. In that time, I'm just going to have a little jump into the chat, see what's going on, check in for any questions that I might have missed at this stage. So I'm seeing questions. Boiling 212. Did I say 200? I meant 212, 100 degrees Celsius. Boil it. Just boil it. It's fine. I wouldn't stress too much about it. It can be just under if you need it to be. Because the coffee's brewed, it's just less of a concern when it comes to the impact on taste. So off the boil is kind of okay. and 1. Try and keep my my lids nice and neat for you. I'll just pop you in here. Lovely. It's me again. Welcome back. So we're going to add 230 grams of water to the bowl when it's time to brew. I'll say that again as I pour it and the kettle's not going, but 8 ounces or 230 grams of water fresh off the boil for today. Okay. Are we still getting clipping on here now, or just those of you having audio issues, can you tell me, has that fixed it? Are things sounding a little cleaner? This is wild. Mixed bag of opinions on the sound. Very stressful for me, I have to tell you. Not sure what's causing it. If there's some sort of interruptions on the stream, we're on a pretty good network here. Okay, I'm going to get on with this. Hush now, and just add some water. 230. Lovely. What I will say is I will slurp very gently today, because that will definitely clip the audio if I do that wrong. So a day of gentle slurping, from me anyway. And last one. Lovely. Get you out of the way, a bit more space. And I'll just give these a little stir. Now, if you're way behind or you're way ahead in this process, No stress. We've got lots of time. Nothing's going to happen that's super important yet. I'm not really worried about one drop of cross-contamination between the coffees here. So there's quite a lot to talk about when it comes to kind of a guided tasting. And one of the really important things today is that I guide you, but I don't necessarily lead you from a tasting perspective. What I want to do is kind of help you break apart what you're tasting. But what's really important to me, and actually really important for this whole experiment, is that I don't try and convince you that what I like is right and what you like should be what I like. You know what I mean? Like, this is about your preference and understanding your preference, and not about trying to get it to align with my preference. So I'm not really going to talk about any of my own preferences till right at the end, maybe. But that's kind of something I'm going to be kind of conscious of. And if you ever feel like I'm trying to get you to think something or prefer something, then I'm not, and you should ignore me, because I'm doing it wrong. But that's a kind of key part of this. What we are going to do, though, is try to break apart the tasting experience into kind of component pieces, because when you do that, when you break it down into simpler pieces, this complex thing becomes much less frustrating. Because comparative tastings are great, but if you taste a bunch of stuff, you'll often have the experience of, well, yeah, this is different to that, and this is really different to that, and I might like this more than that, but I couldn't, easily communicate to you why it is the case. And understanding the kind of why, I think, is the really exciting and interesting bit of doing these kind of tastings. So what I'm going to do, just for me, is decant out a little bit of coffee for each one. I'll try and leave these in order. I'm going to share my tasting here, so I'm not going to have all the coffee. It's also 6 p.m. here in the UK, and so as I get older, I just have to be a little bit more careful about that sort of a thing, caffeine. I do enjoy some decaf and half caff in my life. Have I just done that in totally the wrong order? I have, haven't I? I've just put this in the wrong place. Sorry. Losing my mind. I don't know why. I don't know why. That should be right. That should be, as we look top down, that should be the order in which we're tasting these, from A, B, C, and D on the end there. Good. Hope that's making sense. Going off the rails. I know. It's too early. It's either too early or too late. I haven't had enough caffeine, or I've had too much. It could go either way. But there you go. There we go. Yeah, sorry about that. Just don't know what happened. There's too many things at once for a simple man like me. So just quickly, let's run through the sharing of tasting in terms of how that's going to work if you want to share with other people. There's a few ways you can do it. Obviously, if it's just you and you've got a mug of coffee, you can, if you want to, drink from the mug of coffee. Let it cool down a little bit more first. If not that, then the spoon. We will be slurping today, wherein you'll take a small amount of spoon on the coffee, very gently aerate it as you begin to taste. It's a bit early to taste, so don't start tasting just yet. I'm just going to walk through the kind of process a little bit. That's the gentle slurp for today. We're not going to get the big slurps. The audio is stressing me out too much. Well, maybe towards the end we can have some slurps when it's all kind of coming good. If you are sharing with other people, there's the 2-spoon method, which I find to be insanely stressful, but it's for people who really, really, really want to slurp from a spoon. So you can decant spoon to spoon. This way, your tasting spoon never touches the liquid that you share with anyone else. You can slurp and you can have fun and do all of those things. What I think is kind of easier most of the time, just a little tasting cup. And that's kind of become more normal for me in my day-to-day life, where you can just have a little sample in the cup and have a nice time. Now, these are still a little bit hot, but I think we could gently start to kind of work our way through this. when you're scoring, your opinion during this tasting is going to change, right? And so what's going to happen is, I would say, think about your initial marks that you put on here as pencil marks, but as you get right towards the end and you kind of really lock in how you feel, treat those more as pen marks. It's going to be interesting to see how your scores change, whether you think things kind of go up or down in intensity on the different categories. But that's going to be really important. And in fact, I would say you want to have a kind of taste of each of these before you even think about making a note, right? Just to kind of get the lay of the land, understand what's out there. Here, we just want to see what's going on, what's happening, what are the different flavors. Don't think too much about them. Just experience that there are some differences here. It's going to be some fun. And then when you've had a little taste of everything, which I'll do now, just to see where we are. Then I think we can start to work category by category. And this is really the sort of secret to tasting and tasting effectively, is that you're not trying to assess everything. You're going to break it down to one simple component. And I would say the first one is probably the first one on your card. It's kind of the easiest one, and that's going to be bitterness. Bitterness is, I think, a sensation a lot of us are familiar with in coffee. I used to hear people talk about specialties having no bitterness, which I think was probably a terrible lie. But you know, bitterness is present in all things coffee. You experience it, you detect it all over your mouth actually, but you tend to experience it more towards the back of the tongue in a weird sort of way, that sort of bite and bitter pain. Though it's not always an unpleasant sensation. We have lots of bitter things that we really, really enjoy. Bitterness can be extremely complementary to other flavors and very enjoyable, or it can be very unpleasant to a lot of people. It's a very divisive kind of taste sensation. What I want you to do as you start is move from A to B and think, is this more or less bitter? B to C, is this more or less bitter? C to D, is this more or less bitter? Has it gone up? Has it gone down? Start with that kind of an exercise. And then once you've understood that, then you can start to feel like, okay, well, then I think then one of these might be a lower bitterness. One of these might be quite high in bitterness for me, but don't ink it in yet. Just leave a little mark, because as you taste, as we go back, your opinions may well change. Have a little taste thinking about that. At this point, you're not trying to get flavors, you're not trying to get notes, nothing like that. Just focus on this one characteristic. Then the next one I want you to think about is acidity. And in the world of tasting, there's a phenomenon known as bitter-sour confusion, where a lot of people experience sourness in products they don't expect it to find it, or acidity, and they describe it as bitter. That kind of very unpleasant sourness to some people are like, oh, it's bitter, it must be bitter, where in fact it's a different sensation. Again, you detect sourness all over the tongue and in the mouth, but you'll experience it sort of along the sides of the tongue a little bit more. So it's that kind of sharp, pleasing, think crisp apple, think citrus fruits, acidity kind of lights up the tongue along the side. That's what you're looking for. And again, as you move from one to the other, to the other, to the other, just start to think, how is that characteristic changing? Is it better? Is it worse? Now here on the score sheet, we're asking you to gauge the presence of acidity, not necessarily how much you like it. That will factor into preference down below, but we do want to sort of see how much you can, how much do you sort of perceive there? Is it high in acidity, whether you like it or not? Is it low in acidity, whether you like it or not? Or is it sitting somewhere kind of in the middle? in. I've seen a few people ask, yes, this is going to be available afterwards to restream. If you're not tasting live and you want to taste later, you'll still be able to taste along with us as we go. To really forcibly rein in my slurps at this point. Okay. Now, what I want you to do, these are already starting to cool for me here. Maybe it's not the warmest here in the UK. If you're in a very hot place, it'll be a little slower. But if you go back to your initial assessments, take bitterness again, go back to what you thought you tasted and taste it again, because the coffees will change. And it's in part, I think there is some chemical shift happening in the coffees, but primarily the shift is in you, the taster. You're better at tasting things the cooler they are or the closer they are to body temperature. And so when things are very hot, you're not as good at tasting them. And as they get cooler and cooler, they get kind of easier to taste. And things like describing flavors within them do get easier and easier again. So again, it's not just go through bitterness once, make a judgment. Now that they've cooled down a little bit, go back and revisit your scores. We'll do this one more time before we wrap at the end. But I think it's really interesting to sort of look at what you decided it tasted like, and then now, does that match up? And it's okay and very normal if that's shifted a little bit during the tasting. Now, this is a relatively simple score sheet. There are other attributes that I think it's extremely interesting to think about. And one of them, I'll say, is mouthfeel, texture. You know, it's a difficult word. It's one of the more pretentious sounding words in tasting. You know, I remember going to a tasting where they would talk about, is it like skim milk, 2% whole, does it have a different kind of mouthfeel? Is one richer, is one lighter? Again, you're trying to almost divorce the presence of mouthfeel. It's got a lot of texture, it's very heavy, from preference. You might like lighter, delicate things, and this has a lot of texture. And that's okay how you feel about it. It's just how do you feel these textures are different between the coffees? And I would say there's a good textural variation between them. And then we're going to talk about tasting notes, which is always the bit that I get the most stressed by in any tasting, because a lot of people get stressed by the idea of tasting notes. And I should explain most of the time what tasting notes really mean. They're kind of missing a really important phrase that should go right in front of them. So when someone tastes this or tastes a coffee, and take an imaginary coffee, and they say, oh, it tastes like blackberries. The bit before that that's missing is that within coffee, it kind of reminds me of the taste of blackberries. It's not an explicit flavor that you're going to find there as if it's an added flavor. You're kind of looking to contextualize the flavor. It might remind you of something fruity, and you can start there and be like, okay, it's something fruity. Is it something berry-like? Is it something red berry-like? And it's not going to taste exactly like a raspberry or a blackberry or a cranberry, but it will remind you of that thing, and that's what you're kind of chasing. And you can start at a very high level and be totally accurate and be like, it's kind of fruity, or it's kind of sweet and chocolatey, or it's a kind of very broad umbrella flavor. But you can then start to pick into it and be like, well, it kind of reminds me a little bit more of maybe pear than apple. And you might feel pretentious in that moment, but it's not. You're just trying to sort of feel around flavor to get where you need to go, to sort of say what it reminds you of. And what it reminds you of is going to be different to what it reminds me of, because we've lived different lives and we've eaten different things, and there's no singular correct tasting note for any coffee. I think it's really important too. So as you start to taste these, you can just start to think about, oh, this reminds me of what, whatever it is. And that's where notes is really useful. And notes, you can mark down stuff around texture and mouthfeel. How does it leave your mouth feeling after you taste it? That's the finish. As you swallow and you sit there, what flavors linger? What feelings linger? These, I think, are really enjoyable characteristics. You'll often find coffee people talk about balance, which is a much more complex sort of term. And I think one where it's hard often to sort of do an effective sort of scoring of balance without having tasted a great deal of coffee with people. What you think is balanced, what I think is balanced, may not always marry up. And it's a kind of close to philosophical thing as much as anything else, like whether you think something that might have lots of acidity and some sweetness and not much body, whether you feel that whole thing is balanced or not, may be different to whether I feel that's balanced or not. Generally, I would argue balance is sort of a little presence of everything without anything sticking out too much. It's listening to music and it's just sounding like music and the guitar isn't too loud. And when it is, when it's a bad mix, that's not balanced. And the same thing I think is true with coffee. I'm just going to keep tasting. And so at this point, one more time from the top, assess your scores and see again how they've changed. And then this is kind of interesting to me too. If you've been tasting in one order, I think that's really good and really useful. Now I want you to go the other way and then kind of randomize it, because a lot of our sense of smell and taste works through contrast. And so the last thing you tasted will be the benchmark for this. So going from this to this will have a different experience than going from, say, this to this, or this to this, or this to that. So now start to bounce around between the different coffees to see a kind of different form of contrast happening. It's really interesting. Let's have a look at what's going on in here. All right, got a few questions I'll answer. Does oxidization change the taste? Generally, when you're tasting coffee, oxidization will happen, but incredibly slowly, and you will have a comfortable hour, if not more, with these kind of coffees. If you start to heat them actively during that time and expose them to air, as you might do on a hot plate, then you tend to degrade them pretty quickly. But if you're just letting them cool, then they tend to taste great for a surprisingly long time, especially when you kind of go into kind of tasting mode and you're comparing and contrasting. So one more request on acidity versus bitterness. And that's a great question, and it is one of the most frustrating aspects of tasting. Acidity, you tend to experience down the sides of your tongue. It kind of makes something feel juicy or crisp. People often use the word bright to describe coffees high in acidity, but it's a kind of experience down the side. It'll remind you of fruit in that way. It could be unripe fruit and sour. It could be nice ripe fruit that still has nice acids. Like, again, a great apple has wonderful acidity and a really nice matching sweetness to it. So that's acidity. Bitterness, it is a harder experience to explain in that way, but you tend to experience it more at the back of the mouth and sometimes in the throat as well, almost like you feel it in your throat a little bit. It'll remind you of things like 100% chocolate, quite bitter, or tonic water. Those have that kind of slight bite to them almost of bitterness, and experienced in a different place, and it should trigger a kind of different association to you. Ooh, a great question on what do people mean by clarity? I love this question. It's a really difficult question to answer, but it's a really good question. For me, you know how I talked about kind of finding your way from fruit to berries down to whatever sort of particular berry you might find, or whatever kind of citrus fruit you might find. The ease in which you can sort of see to a clear flavor, to me, is kind of clarity. In really great coffee, the flavors are kind of separate and you can kind of pick them out. If we went to music, if you chose to, you can hear each instrument playing. In a bad mix, things get kind of muddy and squashy, and you're like, I can't really clearly taste individual flavors very well here. It's a bit like I'm looking at an out of focus picture. I know it's kind of some sort of red fruit, but I can't clearly see what it is. And I think when you get more clarity in coffee, it's almost easier to detect those kind of flavors. Is there a deadline to submit? Yes, I think the survey will close tomorrow evening. so that we can get to work on the data analysis. There's going to be a lot of data to comb through, we hope, and very excited to see what comes of this. All right. Check back in. Some other questions. Will I use the data to design the perfect blend of coffee? It's a good question. You're in. I don't know if that's possible. I think the thing that we're going to discover is that people have wildly varying preferences, and that's really interesting and important. And I think we probably have preconceptions about different groups and their preferences. And I'm not sure those are necessarily accurate. I think we don't really know what people think. We see what they buy, and we might ask them something. But this, I think, is kind of interesting as a totally different way to kind of get a preference test out of people. Okay. Yes, and all the data from the survey will be released. Once it's anonymized, it'll be tidied up and made available open source. We'll obviously share what we find in it, but I'm sure some very smart people will also find some fascinating trends in there. Yes, this is not supposed to be proprietary data. This is about us collectively learning together. That's the bit that gets me very excited about this. What does texture feel like? That's a good question. It can be a bunch of different things, actually. If you think about, tea, as you're going to go from weak tea to strong tea, there's a real change in how that feels to drink. And the same thing is true with coffee. Interestingly here, the strength of all of these is pretty much identical, I would say, as in there's the same amount of dissolved soluble material in each of these things, but they don't all feel the same to drink in the mouth. Some of them might feel lighter and a bit more tea-like, and others will feel heavier and kind of rounder and fuller, almost like there's a creaminess to them. That's often a sort of sensation where it's not fatty in that way, but it has something that reminds you of something richer and fuller in the mouth. It's a great question. All right, let me just check in on the chat. Okay, how is everyone feeling in terms of having had a good chance to assess these and begin to lock in some scores? I will tell you, these have changed quite a lot for me during this tasting, quite surprisingly. And again, the fun thing about those changes is that's mostly you. It's not really the coffee, it's mostly you. And I think that's just super cool. I think, it's good to understand the limitations of us as humans, and also, apply appropriate expectations to professional tasters. They are better at it, but they're still ultimately human and potentially flawed in that way. Now, I don't necessarily, there's a lot of people posting your preferences into the chat. I'm not against it, but I will reveal in a second what everything is. All right. Now, you've got to promise me that once you've locked this in, you're not going to change it. And then we have the final preference questions on the back, right? Don't forget these. These are really important. First question, between these three here, A, B, C, which was your favorite? Which do you prefer? You may choose one. And then we want to know between this one and this one, A and D, which was your preference? So two separate questions. Really, really very excited to know your thoughts about this. And if you're curious, I could tell you what the coffees were, but you have to lock in your answers at this point because you're going to be tempted to change them. Everyone always is. I don't know why, but it was just human nature. There's no correct answers here, but still, are you all locked in? Because I'll get the results out for you in a second if you are. Let's check the chat. I'm seeing lots of locked in. Great. I guess it's time to talk about the coffees then. Should we talk about the coffees? Should we start here at A, a little reveal? So this is roasted by Clatch. Lovely people at Clatch, the Perrys. Got to know Heather through barista competition. This coffee, do you want a second to throw in your suggested origin? Folks, do you want to just have a little guess at this point? I always enjoy when people have a guess. Come on, guess, or country of origin for A. Oh, some people are right. It's a really, yeah, here we go. I love seeing this. I love seeing the chat explode with answers and ideas. This is the greatest. Okay, some good guesses. Lots of you are correct. But this is a coffee from Kenya. It's a washed coffee. I think, you know, it's for me, it's a kind of clean, sweet fruit. It's quite high in acidity. It's not super blackcurranty, or that's always a tricky descriptor. In the UK, blackcurrants are really common, and how we experience a lot of black fruit as a child. We have a blackcurrant drink. I know blackcurrants are just not that common in the US, so I have to not use that descriptor. I think the descriptor they used, which was red apple for this, actually is a good description of the kind of acidity here. Different fruits have different kinds of acid. Obviously, fruits like citrus have citric acid. Things like apples have malic acid. And that has a nice kind of apple-y, sharp crispness to it that I really like. And I think the description of caramel in there is nice. It's a kind of balanced acidity-sweetness combo. I would say for me, my bitterness score would be pretty low here. My acidity score would be pretty high. Nice though, it's a pretty coffee, quite light in terms of texture. I wouldn't go to tea-like, but I would go to almost, there's something fruit juice about it to me. I think that's the sort of bit that's pinging in my brain. It reminds me of kind of fruit juice more than tea, but it is, I think, an elegant, complex, very enjoyable washed coffee there. Now, I can really trip you up in a second and say, do you want to guess the origin for B? Someone said A tasted better as it cooled down. This is a kind of classic coffee that kind of opens up as it cools down. It gets easier to pick apart the flavors in it. So B, oh, lots of good guesses in here. Now, I've been a bit mean here. You get to be very right, a lot of you, because in fact, B is a blend. So B, George Hell, pioneering roaster, amazing coffee professional, hugely influential, just one of the most knowledgeable, fascinating people with an incredible company. Huge fan of George Hell. This is Alchemy, which is a blend of his. So it's a kind of interesting combo of washed and natural processed coffees. And for me, this was in the kind of browner flavor section. So kind of more of the chocolate, nuts. It's got some nice texture to it. This one was interesting to me as it cooled down. For me, the sort of shift in bitterness on this one was kind of notable, where quite hot, it had quite a strong bitterness for me, or I noticed the bitterness more. And as it cooled, that kind of faded away into a kind of very balanced cup, sweet, very enjoyable. Just it's one of those kind of Moorish coffees now, just, you know, like very chocolatey. To me, it's kind of the kind of Maillard section of browning reactions that turn things, make things very enjoyable to us. That for me hits those kind of notes. So I didn't tell you the blend. Oh, dear me. So there's 4 coffees in there. Brazil, Costa Rica, El Salvador, and Ethiopia in there. So quite a complex blend. But I think for me, a kind of classic kind of medium roast level, but just, you know, developed kind of sugars, nice mouthfeel. All right. Now C is interesting. Tell me about C. Have a little guess. C, again, I will tell you now, is a blend. Any guesses for C? Oh, I see some good answers here. So yeah, the Equator Coffee, C. Any guesses as to what this was? Have another taste. All right, I will reveal. So C is a kind of classic blend executed really well. It's a Mocha Java blend. So it is Ethiopia and Sumatra. The Ethiopian coffee is a natural process coffee, and the Sumatran coffee is wet hulled, which is a really interesting process that has quite a distinct flavor to it. That is, I think, a kind of divisive flavor for some people. Do I need to explain wet hulling? Maybe I should. Usually what happens is that you would pick coffee fruit, squeeze the seeds out, and they'd be covered in a layer called parchment. And there might be something sticky on there that you might want to get rid of. Some sort of sticky fruit flesh, for want of a better term, often called mucilage. None of the words are good. The wash process breaks that down through some fermentation and then washes it away. In, say, a honey process, you might dry it down and then break the parchment away later. Wet hulling almost immediately takes away the parchment layer around the coffee, exposing the green bean, and it starts to sort of age and change its flavor quite distinctly. It's a really traditional practice in that part of the world, and it has quite a distinct flavor that I think is quite present here. Now, this is, I think, the highest in bitterness on the table and a kind of classic dark roast. I didn't get, if we're talking about acidity here, this for me is a very low acidity coffee. You know what I mean? The sides of my tongue don't really light up that way. It makes it feel very heavy and very full and very rich, which I think a lot of people like. And that's two things. That's one, the roast level. So by roasting it darker, you do essentially react away the acids in coffee and they become other sort of aroma compounds and other things. And two, both of those coffees themselves, wet hulled coffees tend to be quite low in acidity. Natural coffees from Ethiopia can be up and down in acidity, but natural processes often do have a little less acidity compared to, say, certainly a washed coffee. So here, those kind of earthier tones to this, that kind of heaviness to it, mostly for me coming from the wet hulled coffee from Sumatra that's in there. Interesting. Now, D is from one single origin again. I look forward to your guesses in the chat. Oh, I love it. There are less correct guesses in this one, and I think we can talk about why. I think a lot of people have guessed Ethiopia for this one. It's not a coffee from Ethiopia. So Black and White Roasters, again, superb roasting company. I need to drink more of their coffees, actually. It's been hard to get their stuff in the UK, and I should fix that soon. Or should I go and visit, probably. It would be nice. This coffee is an unusual coffee. So it's from Colombia, which is perhaps surprising because it has a lot of the kind of flavors you might associate with sort of natural process Ethiopians, because it is a natural process coffee. Now, I think it's anaerobically processed as a natural, which means that the whole cherries were dried, but they were also deprived of oxygen, which changes the way that they would ferment as they dry. This, to me, is an interesting variety that I'm still trying to get my head around, a Chiroso. Read some competing things, whether it is an Ethiopian landrace or not, I'm not sure, but it's an interesting and unusual variety found mostly in Antioquia. Is that my pronunciation correct there? Antioquia, thank you. In Colombia, where this farm is. This has a lot of those kind of classic natural process flavors, like a little bit tropical, a Lots of fruits, lots of dried fruits as well as ripe fruits. Really complex. Now this one, these tend to be a little bit divisive for some people. Some people really like the kind of fermented flavors these carry. They're kind of, complex, juicy. I will say for people who like a little splash of milk or cream in their coffee, these can be much more controversial or divisive styles of coffee to drink. But I think so interesting and so distinct and so unusual. What throws people here is like, well, okay, where's my acidity here? I get lots and lots of fruit, but does that mean there's lots and lots of acidity in the cup? And when you break it down, it's kind of interesting to kind of step back a little bit, but like, forget all the flavors, forget everything else, just focus on the acidity, bounce between the two. That's when I think breaking these apart gets really interesting. Yeah, like lots of, I mean, it's a quite difficult coffee to describe, but also super easy to describe, because I feel like there's so much fruit quality to it that you could pick almost any kind of fruit word and you'd kind of be right. You know what I mean? Like it's tons of complexity in this. And then a really nice sort of matching, balancing sweetness to the whole thing. Now, yeah, there's people noting that this one really, again, this one changed a lot for me. Like the acidity changed a lot, the flavors changed a lot. It really kind of opened up as it cooled down, and it became kind of easier to taste and kind of pick apart. And there was sort of more and more going on as it cooled down. Again, don't be afraid to bounce back and forwards between them now and focus on things like acidity again. Comparing these two is really interesting. Just between these two, backwards and forwards on that front, very enjoyable. All right. Right, I'm going to answer a few questions because we're getting on in terms of time. Where does the time go? This is amazing. I'm so glad we've had so much fun. I'm loving seeing your opinions here in the chat, even if I can't kind of work it out. I will say, Cometeer have hooked those of you up who are tasting and enjoying this thing. There's a link in the description. There's a discount code down there as well. You get 20 bucks off if you want to taste something. Thank you to Cometeer. This has been a really fun experience for me. I'll try and catch a few questions just quickly before we wrap up and make sure that I've sort of caught everything in this tasting. But this has been a lot of fun. I haven't disclosed my favorite, and I'm torn. I have a preference for kind of fruit, and I'm sort of torn between A and D. I would find that question of which is my favorite a little bit harder. I'm not going to give you my answer. How would I compare these to normal brew methods? That's a good question. These feel like close to filtered coffee, like paper filtered coffee to me in terms of clarity, texture, those kind of things. I would say that's about that. Let me just check the other channel with other questions. Is it okay if none of the coffees feel like a 5? Absolutely fine. You know what I mean? You probably will have experienced more bitterness and more acidity, and it's okay for this to be your scale of things. If you're worrying about your scores now, please don't. Interesting that someone noted that they usually go for lighter roast, but C was their favorite. I think this is where kind of breaking apart flavor, you can discover some interesting things, and it might be the texture of this that kind of spoke to you, or it might be the flavors, it might be something else. It's really interesting. Ooh, should you pick the, if you were to buy a coffee, should you buy one that you prefer warm or when cool? I mean, to some extent, this is a good question. I like this question. To some extent, I would say pick the one you prefer cool, because I feel like as you get into enjoying what coffee can really offer, letting your coffee cool down that little bit more, and when you want to, spending a little bit of time with it is very rewarding. It doesn't have to be that. You can just grab a cup and enjoy it and go to work, and coffee can be that too. But coffees that are, pay you back for the little bit of attention you invest in them, I think are always going to be my preference, because I think it just makes coffee tons of fun. I'm seeing a few super chats coming in. I will say, any super chat donations will be donated to World Coffee Research, who we've traditionally supported through these things. I'll match any donations that go in as well, just to add that pot up. Thank you to everyone who is super chatting. I just want to make sure that that's where that money is going to go, not to me. I will match it. For preference score, I think it would be the easiest way I would summarize preference score is if I just asked you how much do you like it on a scale of 1 to 5. Not necessarily, is this the most interesting? It's preference. It's which one do you want to drink? Which one do you prefer? It may not be the most interesting and complex thing. I want to know what you would want to drink if you had the choice to do so. Thank you for lovely people donating. That will go to sort of the research into the future of coffee in terms of from a producer's point of view, making sure coffee is a viable crop into the future. At some point, we'll do a video on the stuff that World Coffee Research is doing, because I think it's really important. They're a great organization, and we have supported them in the past, and we'll continue to do so. Okay. Yeah, I feel like there's some accurate descriptions there. 1 is you hate it, 5 is you love it, 3 you are indifferent. I think that's pretty fair. You know, however you want to express it is kind of fine. It's kept as a simple scale to not overly complicate it. Just let us know which one you liked. As long as the one that you enjoyed the most has the highest preference score, I think we're solid. Okay. Is there a specific reason for the selection of these coffees? Yes, there is. I don't know if I want to tell you. I know you've all promised that you've locked in your scores and you aren't going to change them. In the follow-up video that I'll make when we look at the data, I'll explain how and why we chose these ones and what questions we're ultimately asking or trying to ask in the kind of the data. So it's a good question. I'm sorry I'm not going to give you a fuller answer, but yes, this was quite intentional, and we thought about it for quite a long time and argued about what it should be and tasted a bunch of stuff. And so this was this. All of you people saying thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who took time out of their day, came and tasted with us. These are really fun for me. They're also mildly terrifying, but they are really fun, and I hope you have a lot of fun doing them. I can, if you've got extra capsules, go and give this experience to someone else. Like, go and share this. Comparative tastings can be so easy, and they're so much fun, and you can't get it wrong. Just tasting and comparing is just the easiest, most fun thing to do. So thank you. Thank you. Oh, you're going to make me broke again. I said this last time that I matched donations, and it really caught me out. We'll still do it. I'm a man of my word. Okay. If you think about mixing the leftovers, don't do it. Yeah, blending is a complex thing, and yeah, I would say enjoy them individually rather than there. But we're going to get some really interesting results out of this. I'm so excited to share all the data we collect with this. Some of you asked why Square Mile isn't in the lineup, because I'm not trying to push Square Mile on anyone here. And I think these coffees were perfect for what we were trying to do, and that was the right reason to choose them. There we go. Okay. I think we're an hour in. I think we've caught every question that I needed to. Thank you, everyone who's donating madly. I'll make sure that we also say how much we raised in the next video, so you know where your money's going. Appreciated very much. Good question. Roast level on D. I would say roast level on D is a similar roast level to the roast level on A. So it's on the lighter end of things. I wouldn't say it's an identical roast level, but I would say these are in a similar roast level. Okay, I've had too much caffeine too. It's 7 o'clock in the evening for me now, so you know that's going to be more of an intense experience for me going to sleep tonight. But I'm usually pretty wired after these things too. Anyway, caffeine aside. Okay. There's questions about Europe. I will say this now. I'd love to do this kind of preference testing in other geographies too in the future. This was a great opportunity to do it with the US. And I think what we get out of it's going to be super interesting. But yes, obviously, I'd love to do more of this kind of stuff. It's so much fun. It's so interesting. Okay, I think we're going to wrap up the stream here. Thank you, everyone who took part. You have been amazing. I hope you had a lot of fun. Please submit your data. We'd really love to know a little bit more about you. and what you thought of these coffees and your preferences therein. And then we'll be sharing this, all of the information that we get with this, with all of you, so you can learn more about the American preference for coffee. Okay, that's me. I think I'm done. Thank you so, so much for watching. I hope you have a great day.